So welcome, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear friends, good afternoon. On behalf of the ESPKU, the European Society for Phenylketonuria and Allied Metabolic Disorders, I am delighted to welcome you to this session on defining unmet medical need, what counts. I know I don't need to tell this audience at the European Health Forum in Gastein that the EU's General Pharmaceutical Legislation is under revision, and that this revision will likely include an updated definition of unmet medical need. And I am sure that our panel will say more about this in any case. But I want to say this: while this discussion may sound like a technical policy issue, it has real consequences. It has the potential to unite us or to divide us. How need is defined will determine what gets incentivized and funded, which diseases are prioritized, and which conditions are quietly reclassified as no longer serious enough to require innovation, or simply solved. For our community, for PKU, and for many other rare diseases, this is not an abstract discussion. It is deeply personal. As ESPKU, we represent 41 national and regional organizations across Europe. I serve as secretary of the ESPKU and director of the German PKU patients community, which, by the way, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And if I look a little tired, it's because we just hosted our annual ESPKU multi-stakeholder conference in Hamburg last weekend with more than 500 clinical experts, researchers, industry representatives, PKU patients, their families, and their representatives, all together from 37 countries and 4 continents. For those of you who are not familiar with PKU, phenylketonuria, this is a rare inherited metabolic disorder. When you have PKU, your body cannot break down or metabolize phenylalanine, an amino acid found in protein. If not carefully managed, it becomes toxic to the brain, causing irreversible neurological damage, cognitive impairment, and psychiatric issues. The standard of care is a nutritional therapy, a low-protein diet, supplemented with medical food to compensate for the lack of natural protein. It has remained largely unchanged since the 1960s. It is difficult, expensive, time-consuming, and not always as effective as we expect it to be. Thanks to newborn screening, most children with PKU are diagnosed within days after birth. But that is only the beginning. From the moment of diagnosis, parents are asked to take responsibility for a highly restrictive, lifelong treatment, particularly difficult in infancy, when nutritional needs are constantly changing and the risk of poor control is highest. Children, teenagers, and adults live with constant calculation, weighing food, reading labels, monitoring blood levels. Families spend hours each day planning meals and source low-protein special food. A small glass of milk or 2 small potatoes equal the protein amount many patients are allowed a day. And I can tell you, for us, this condition is far away from being solved. And PKU illustrates exactly why a narrow definition of unmet medical need can be tricky. We have low mortality, but a high daily burden, high emotional and high economic costs, and often suboptimal outcomes. If our frameworks measure only what can be captured in clinical endpoints, they will systematically miss the real picture of need. Indeed, history offers a cautionary tale. Already back in 1935, a year after Professor Völling discovered PKU, in 1935, PKU treatment with a phenylalanine-free protein were delayed by 20 years because experts back then deemed the idea unaffordable. In other words, not cost-effective, not necessary. It was a decision made by systems that did not see our community as in sufficient need to justify expense. So no, this is not just a technical policy issue, but at the same time, it is a deeply complex issue. This is why we are grateful to the Gastein organizers for making space for this conversation, one that cuts to the heart of this year's theme, rethinking solidarity in health. Because yes, we need a definition of unmet medical need that is clear, workable, and measurable. But we must also challenge the assumption behind our policy frameworks. We have to examine the technical and the ethical, and ensure that this definition serves the patients. We need to design systems of incentives that support innovation without bankrupting patients, developers, or health systems. Systems that do not end up pitting one community against another, asking who suffers more, but instead strengthen our collective solidarity. That is why we are so proud to be here at Gastein for this discussion. And so, with further ado, I am pleased to hand over to our moderator, Treasure Bolt, who will guide us through this session today. Treasure.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you to everyone here in the room, as well as online. As Tobias just has said, the question how we define unmet medical needs is more than a definition. It's really it's a policy concept that for the years to come will define how we prioritize, how we incentivize innovation for not only rare diseases, also other diseases, and possibly will also kind of define how systems see diseases as well as patient populations. As Tobias also highlighted, we're now in the final stages of the EU's revision of the General Pharmaceutical Legislation. The trilogue negotiations are on the way, with the final text expected by the end of the year. The challenge that ESPKU and PKU as representative for many rare diseases that today do have a standard of care, but still a high unmet need. The challenge that they're facing with the definition as it stands today that is very much rooted, or the proposed definition, I should say, by the European Commission, is very much rooted in measures, criteria of disease mortality and morbidity. So very kind of clinically focused on clinical criteria. What we've seen with the Parliament is that the Parliament has taken responded in its report by broadening the concept of morbidity, by also calling out for quality of life, the importance of daily functioning of patients, to recognize the burden of the treatment, whereas the Council, on the other hand, has kind of gone back to returning more traditional clinical interpretations, highlighting efficacy and safety. All of these concepts are very much important, but at the same time, we're at a crossroads, and that's to kind of use an old cliche. So what today's session is about, and I'm going to introduce the speakers in a second, is really kind of unpacking what's really at stake. And that's also the reason why we wanted to use PKU. There are many diseases. PKU is not more or less important than diseases, but it is indicative of a disease where I think it sets an example for many rare diseases, non-rare diseases, where a lot is at stake for patients in the years to come. So we're going to look at what is the issue and what does solidarity mean in this context, tying it back to the concept of Gastein this year. What does solidarity mean within the patient population? How will we look at diseases in patient populations if we end up with a more restricted definition of unmet medical need? Today, we're very pleased to be joined by a very kind of expert, thoughtful group of panelists, each bringing their own kind of perspective on how this policy debate is unfolding. As Anita has said, I don't know much about politics. This isn't about politics. This is very much about a conversation in a room. but where I think we all realize that policy matters. It matters for patients' daily life and what they can expect in the years to come. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers, and then we open up the conversation. And I would encourage the room, and I will definitely pull you in, but I very much hope there's many of you here in the room, but just to kind of think about questions and how you want to engage in the coming hour. So I'm just starting with Professor Dr. Anita MacDonald, consultant dietitian specialized in PKU at Birmingham Children's Hospital, as well as a board member of ESPKU, the Patient Organization Scientific Board. Thomas Bowles, Head of Government Affairs and Patient Engagement at PTC Therapeutics, one of the developers. Thomas is also a board member of EUCOPE and Europa Bio, trade associations based in Brussels. Dr. Stefan Thierstrup, Chief Medical Officer at the EMA. The EMA will also be tasked once we have see the final kind of general pharmaceutical legislation adopted. EMA will also be tasked with developing the detailed scientific guidelines on how to apply the unmet medical need criteria, so we're definitely coming back to that. And then finally, Rosa Castro, Public Affairs Director of Eurodis, who today will give a wider patient organization perspective and a wider rare disease perspective, recognizing that PKU is one of many, many rare diseases today. So perhaps why don't we just kick it off, and just to begin, Rosa, why does, from your perspective, and looking at the wider patient community for rare diseases in Europe, why does the new definition of unmet medical need matter for the patient community? Not just in Brussels, but in the member states. Any kind of perspective you want to share?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. PKU is indeed, I think, a great example to zoom in why it matters really at the level of patients, the individuals, the caregivers. Now, let me zooming out from the perspective of Eurodis, Rare Disease Europe, which groups more than 1,000 organizations of different rare diseases. And even though they are rare, we are talking overall about around 30 million people in Europe living with rare diseases. So it matters, and it matters because unmet medical needs the rare disease community has many unmet medical needs at different levels. So lack of treatment is the first one, of course, and we're talking that more than 90% of the people living with rare diseases, of that 30 million that I talk about, don't have a curative treatment. But we are also talking about more than a curative treatment. We are talking about quality of life, about mental health, about holistically considering the unmet medical needs. So the way we define unmet medical needs in the General Pharma Legislation, as it was well said at the beginning, is not a technical issue. It really defines, at the level of the EU, at the core of the solidarity principle, who counts, who doesn't count. It has a really direct effect on individuals and the relatives. So it really deserves a conversation like the one that is happening today.
Thank you. Stefan, perhaps we can just go back for a second to the drivers, the intent of the European Commission's proposed criteria-based definition of unmet medical need. Could you just share your perspective on kind of why the need to change the definition at this point in time, and why the new definition, a clear and hopefully an unambiguous definition, is so important for regulators, but also for healthcare decision makers in health and payer systems in Europe?
Yeah, many thank you, and thanks for having me here. And I think PKU is a great example of kicking this discussion off. EMA is not the European Commission, so we don't write the legislation. No. Secondly, as you pointed out, it's still in negotiation, but there will definitely end somewhere with a requirement for a guideline. Currently, we don't have a guidance on unmet medical need, but we use the term when it comes to deciding whether a product can get an orphan designation or not. And we also use the definition when a product potentially can get what is called a conditional marketing authorization. And in both circumstances, it's very simple in the sense that they said that there is either no treatment for a debilitating or serious life-threatening disease, or the existing therapies are insufficient without defining what insufficient means. So that's a little bit left, or not a little bit, it's left to us to decide. So in that sense, if the legislation in the end comes up with a request for us to draw up a guideline, and that's where looks like we are going, we will of course draw up that guideline, and we can come back to discussing potential how it's going to phrase. But for us, it will be important to have a guidance for industry, and Thomas can speak more to that. It will be important to have a guidance, but it will also, especially, for the industry, it will be important to have a guidance because it sets both the carrot and the stick for development. And also, to Tobias's point, it also conquers and divides between which products for which diseases that will get certain benefits and not. So it's also seen from a political perspective, it's also a driver, so that's the carrot, more carrot than stick, I guess, for driving innovation in areas where there is an unmet medical need, independent on how we end up defining that. For us, it's also important that definition is operationable, that we actually very clear can define whether a certain development looks to fulfill or is fulfilling an unmet medical need or not, because otherwise, if it's too ambiguous, we will end up spending time in the European Court of Justice, because industry sometimes takes us to court because they are I'm not looking at you only, Thomas, it's okay. Because they are dissatisfied with our decision, which of course is their legal right. So I think it's important that we end somewhere that we can navigate the maze, and we also can conquer and divide, and that we can drive innovation forward. So that's the reason why.
Thank you. Let's just kind of have a look at the moment, at this point, at kind of what are the potential risks of a more narrow definition, and using PKU as a case study. Anita, could you just, for those who, Thomas has shared some insights already, but for those who may not know PKU well, can you just help us understand what living with PKU really means and how restrictive you experience the treatment?
Yeah, as Tobias has already told us, the standard of care for PKU is dietary therapy. But it's a dietary therapy like no other. Like you cannot imagine, it's more of a life sentence than a dietary therapy. People with PKU can't eat meat, fish, eggs, cheese, ordinary bread, ordinary pasta. They can't eat cakes or chocolates. Most of the things that was outside at lunchtime would be unsuitable for PKU. The patients, often with classical PKU, can tolerate a small amount of protein, but it would be equivalent to 1 slice of bread per day. So imagine just eating 1 slice of bread. It's incredibly limited. So they get by eating fruits and vegetables. They get by eating special low-protein foods, but these are expensive that many people in many countries have to purchase for themselves. The patients also have to take a special protein replacement that tastes really vile, and they have to have this 4 times a day. So they have to do this for the rest of their life. Not surprisingly, many people with PKU, although it's a lifelong treatment, they really struggle to continue with that diet lifelong. Certainly with the adults that we care for, we would find that something like 2 to 3 adults out of 10 would be able to follow that kind of therapy. So as people grow up, it's not really a standard of care. They really can't manage it. And as a consequence, a lot of adult patients get lost to follow-up. They say, what is the point of going to hospitals? They can't offer us any other treatments. So they drop off with the treatments. There is a huge psychosocial impact of PKU. When a child is first diagnosed with PKU, you can imagine the impact on those parents. They will say that the the neurodevelopment of the child is actually in their hands. They're frightened of making mistakes. Sometimes the relationship with the children is very autocratic. All the time they're having to say, no, 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 you can't have anything more. It is incredibly difficult. In addition to that, it affects socialization in a huge way. People struggle eating outside the house. They struggle going into restaurants. Children will struggle being provided with the right food at nursery or at school, or going to parties, or going on holiday. Many catering establishments now will refuse to make food for people on a PKU diet, a low-protein diet. In addition to this, some of our patients suffer from bullying as a consequence. There's also economic consequences of the diet, not only because people have to purchase the low-protein foods, but also because we find that caregivers or patients themselves will only work part-time, or they will stop work in order to take care of the dietary treatment. You don't find that with a drug, but you will find this with this kind of treatment. In addition, as Tobias hinted, the diet is not perfect. Patients still have health impacts as a consequence of the treatment. So they will still, some of them will have a lower IQ because they can't keep to this dietary treatment. Some of them will have problems with executive function. They will have mental health issues. You can imagine it's enormous living with this kind of thing. People will get headaches, they will get fatigue. The list can go on and on and on. I probably said quite a lot, but that is the impact of living with PKU.
Thank you. Thomas, from a developer and an industry perspective, what are some of the potential implications for innovation looking at, again, potentially more narrow criteria-based definition?
Yeah, thanks for asking, and thanks for inviting me to the panel. I think the starting point is maybe very simple. I think companies, maybe I can't speak for all companies, of course, but I would say most companies, if not all, develop therapies where they believe there's an unmet medical need. Right? You're not developing a therapy when you think that there's no problem or there's no issue. And I think that brings exactly to the core of the discussion, because then you get to a question like, what is then this unmet medical need? And I guess if you ask 10 people for a definition, you get probably 15 different answers, right? And that makes this discussion very, very complicated, particularly if you want to have this complexity sort of reduced to a definition on paper. So no matter what the outcome will be of the definition, the discussion, that, as you said, hopefully we will have some clarity by the end of the year. I think that we'll still follow a lot of discussions about, okay, how do we need to interpret this? Because I think that if you put it just black and white and say if there's a narrow definition versus a wide definition, I think the risk, certainly also from industry's perspective, but I guess also from patients' perspective, with a narrow definition, you run a risk that you exclude elements of a disease that are very important for, in particular, patients, but that maybe, I don't know, the regulator or the policymaker or the payer says, well, that's not in the definition. And so therefore you run a risk that you give maybe not entirely the right signals as the public institution of what you think is important for further innovation. And versus what, for example, the patient community find very important for further innovation. And as Rosa said, if you just look at rare diseases, there are still 95% of the 6,000-7,000 rare diseases that don't. Rosa mentioned a cure, but let alone a therapy, right? Any therapy, or an adequate therapy, or however you said that, define that. So I think if you have a narrow definition, you and not focusing on elements, and you hear that a little bit indeed from the PKU story around elements that go beyond criteria around mortality, morbidity, that are also very important. You run the risk that you qualify certain therapies in disease areas as having a low or maybe a non-existent unmet medical need, and I think that's a little bit the danger of this discussion, right? More specifically from a company point of view, as I said, therapies are developed in companies. I guess the companies always believe there is an unmet medical need, but they don't do this in isolation, of course. They look outside. So if they get a signal from, in this case, from Europe, that there will be a judgment, sort of a legal judgment on this, what they develop, you run a risk indeed that companies will be a little bit more risk averse when they think like, well, this is for diseases that are potentially being viewed as having a low unmet medical need. And that is, of course, I would say undesirable as a sort of knock-on effect. Also because if you then go through this system, as Stefan said, it's at the European level very much linked to concrete incentives. So you meet the definition, then you get incentives. You don't meet the definition, you don't get these incentives. But what Stefan didn't mention, that's just the European level. Because as you know, in Europe, you go through basically through two phases. One, you get your marketing authorization in Europe, and then you have to go to the countries for pricing and reimbursement discussions. So I don't think I need to explain what the impact will be on these kind of discussions, whether you get this stamp of, yes, I met the unmet medical need versus I didn't meet the unmet medical need, but of course I still have a marketing authorization. So these kind of elements, I think, play an important role for industry. And therefore, I think it's very important, at least from industry, but I think that in that sense we are a bit aligned with the patient community, that we have a broad definition. And that is only also seen as maybe just the first step, because then, again, as was indicated, EMA will have to give some meat to this definition through, you said one guideline, but maybe a couple, right? And I think it's also really important that, and that's maybe for you, Stefan, that EMA, when they develop this, they indeed involve the parties involved, in particular the patient, but of course, speaking for industry, I think we would like to be involved also in the thinking around these criteria. So.
Okay, thank you. But perhaps just a follow-up question to Rosa and Anita. Is there a risk to lock patients into suboptimal care? I think Tobias mentioned that the treatment for PKU hasn't changed effectively since the 60s. It's a diet. Do you consider there is a risk? I mean, we know that there are many therapies that have no treatments at all, but for those diseases where there is a treatment, is there a risk that patients will be locked potentially for decades into suboptimal care? Anita, any perspective?
Yeah, no, I think it would be terrible. Right now, we have a community in PKU where some are on drug treatment, some of the patients with milder PKU, and some of the patients with more severe PKU, where the current drug treatments maybe aren't basically taking away the PKU or allowing us to relax the diets. And so we've got a dual community, but I can tell you it's made life really hard for the people with classical PKU, because they can see what could be for them. And I think it would be incredibly cruel and in this day and age to not develop the drug therapies, which we know will work for them. I mean, I've already described the diet. I think if I asked everybody in this room today to follow the diet for 24 hours, every one of you should struggle. And so, you know, why should people with PKU have a lifetime of struggling and difficulty, not being able to follow treatment when there are alternatives? And we talk about we've got a standard of care with dietary treatment. When we started dietary treatment back in the 1950s, it was given to one child, and it happened to work. But there's never been any randomized controlled trials to show that it's worked, so everybody's assumed it's a standard of treatment. But there's no studies in adults to show that it works. There's no studies in teenagers to show that it's worked. So I think we're making a lot of assumptions about the care that we can offer to patients right now, but it would be tragic for those patients if we couldn't offer them new drug therapies in the future.
Rosa, any additional observations?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, just to add very quickly that, the definition really, matters, has an impact, obviously, on the pipelines, on the, at the level of the investment. We know, even though we are talking from the perspective of patients and their suffering and their daily lives, we know that the incentives in the General Pharmaceutical Legislation are supposed to drive the industry to put their investments. But that's what decides really what pipeline will be moved forward and what products will be abandoned. So that really has a big significance in the lives of people living with this in their daily lives. So definitely, yes.
Thank you. Stefan, perhaps just a question for you. EMA, also other regulators, health decision makers have put far greater emphasis in recent years on more patient-focused medicines development, including greater recognition and uptake of patient experience data and recognition of patient-reported outcomes in both the regulatory process, but in fact also in the healthcare decision-making process, HTA's pricing reimbursement. From your perspective, is there a discrepancy between this kind of drive towards patient experience data as part of regulatory approval processes, decision-making, and potentially a definition that is really more based on clinical criteria only? Do you see that as a discrepancy?
No, I see that as a continuum. First of all, EMA have for a long time involved patients and healthcare professionals outside the regulatory framework in our decision-making. We have a healthcare professional and working party. We have a patient and consumers working party. Eurodi sits around the table, among other patient organizations. And the new pharma legislation is actually codifying that we involve patients in our decision-making, the proposal to have more patients on the committees. I know the council was kicking that back a little bit, whether they got voting rights or not. So that's another important thing to see what comes out of the negotiations. But we are very keen and acknowledges the importance of patients' voice. On Monday this week, we released for public consultation a reflection paper on patient experience data. So going a little bit beyond just the patient-reported outcomes that we know from, in particular, oncology trials, and see that as a step in the direction of involving patient and patient experience more in our decision-making. That guidance is out for consultation for the rest of the year. So please engage, read it, and submit your comments. We appreciate that. And that makes me to the other one, whether we are going to write one or several guidelines. Again, that depends on our political masters, how they end up deciding the legislation. Anyway, I think it would be important that if we are talking about more than one guidance, that they are somehow aligned. You cannot, at least not in my head, have one set of definitions of unmet medical need over here to regulate one kind of medicines and another completely different definition. There needs to be some alignment. Otherwise, I can foresee a lot of other discussions and also problems in actually defining what's inside and what's outside here. And if we are, and that looks so, to develop a guidance or more guidances, that guidance will of course also come into public consultation, and we would of course also involve our working parties, including patient and consumers working party, in that development process. And I cannot, it would be speculation about how a definition would look like. I would assume we start where we are now, and then depending also on how prescriptive the legislation will be, because you could imagine that the legislation more or less will define what we have to put in our guidance. And then we have our hands, if not tied, but at least to some extent restricted in what we can do. So let's see how the legislation is going to see, and then we definitely will do that in collaboration with our natural stakeholders, and it will be every guidance we publish come out for public consultation, so there will be a lot of opportunities to come in. And I had something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. I'll come back.
Okay, thank you. Let's just have this year's theme of the conference, as I mentioned earlier, is around solidarity. and social contract. Rosa, how does the definition of unmet medical need, or definitions of unmet medical need, reflect the social contract between patients, innovators, health systems, payer systems? Any thoughts?
Oh, well, I think it goes really to the core, and it asks the very difficult questions, because actually, the value of solidarity in the EU, it's a core value, and it's one that is put into test, I think, in the times we're living right now of crisis and resource constraints. And the way we define this, I mean, we're talking in general, no, a broad definition or a narrow definition will have a very direct impact on, whether the needs of patients are addressed. And as Tobias said at the beginning, we also risk, if we don't have a good definition, one that is taught and that is co-developed with the patients, the ones that know, the clinicians that know the day-to-day impact into patients, then we run the risk of not having a fair. So it's about fairness, right? I mean, a lot of the social contract is about the fairness. And yes, patients expect innovation, of course, and patients are also willing to contribute with their expertise and experience to this process. Now, innovators contribute because they put, they risk, they put some investments and they undertake some risk, because they expect a fair return on their investments and a fair incentive, let's say. And the healthcare systems also contribute because, I mean, usually they aim to leave no one behind. So I think for the community, the rare disease community, for Eurordis, that was a core thing that was addressed in a 2021 study called Rare 2030. So in this panel, I don't have time to explain to you, but I will welcome, invite you to look at that study, because it gathered all parties sitting there and reflecting on what it means to be fair and to address the needs. And I'm just coming back to the definition of unmet medical needs. If I want to give one message, since the beginning, Eurordis was advocating for a definition that, regardless of where it goes, includes patients, as Stefan just said. Now, right now, it's not very clear whether the patients will be involved, so I think it's worth repeating that for our community, it will be very important that the patients are included in the final text of the General Pharmaceutical Legislation. We are kind of in the hands of the Council right now in the negotiations. We hope to be there. It goes beyond that, because the patient organizations also need to have funding to continue the capacity building and the other activities we do to engage patients fully. So patients are part of the solution. We are part of that social contract, willing to contribute, but we need to have a seat in the table to be treated like equals in that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas, perhaps a question for you is like, so solidarity-based health systems in Europe are under pressure, budgets are under pressure, health social care systems in general. How do we balance kind of the affordability and the access to new innovative medicines for underserved populations that may not have any treatments at all, but also diseases such as PKU? Are you kind of hopeful about Europe's ability to maintain that balance? And is that potentially one of the drivers also behind the definition, because it will allow perhaps ambiguous to some extent, but also a clearer definition that will help countries better manage where they prioritize funding for healthcare? Any reflections?
Yeah, what I hear you saying is, and I think that would go a bit against the solidarity, is saying basically you say to a certain patient population, well, you have a treatment which is far from optimum or definitely not even close to curative, so you become less prioritized because we have here a patient community that has no treatment, right? I think that's not the right way to go about it, right? Also because I'm just making now two very black and white examples, of course, but in reality, you don't have that, not in all cases, you have that kind of situation. It's more like a slope, of course, right? I was thinking actually, while you were talking, let's take another disease area and linking it more to your suboptimum treatment, and how we will be stuck at that, right? Let's take HIV/AIDS, right, which I think more people are familiar with than maybe PKU. So HIV/AIDS, correct me if I'm wrong, was around the 80s, early 80s, deadly disease. Yeah, people were dying all over the world. There was no treatment at all. Right? And so there was, after some issues, etc., there was a big drive to find, I guess, a cure. Anyway, to make a long story short, we're now in 2025. I think we don't have a cure for HIV/AIDS, but it is a manageable disease. Right? Thanks to, over those decades, finding sort of new solutions, etc., and to prove it and to improve it. So the almost philosophical question you get is, if you would go back in time and link it to this discussion and say, when would you have decided that there was a low unmet medical need in the HIV/AIDS community? Was it 2 years ago, or was it 10 years ago already? I mean, that makes it very, very difficult to have this kind of disease, which I think speaks to having a more broad definition, and then bring it also back to your question, to not try to divide into black and white, saying, oh, you have no therapy and you have a suboptimal therapy. There is a solidarity behind amongst that, where a broad definition will guarantee that you treat all patients equally. I guess until there is a simple cure, which, as I think everybody knows, is almost exceptional. But that's the goal. I think that everybody has, but that's very difficult to achieve.
Stefan?
I completely agree what you say, Thomas, but we have to realize that independent on how that definition ends, there will still be someone who doesn't fulfill the definition. Because then if we're gonna make a definition that everyone fulfills, I don't think we should waste time writing that guidance. Yeah. So there will always be someone who will fall outside the definition. So it's also about, finding the right balance. And again, that comes back to the legislators. What's the aim of having this definition? What are we wanting to achieve? What are we wanting to drive forward? And what patient groups do we want maybe to prioritize over others? But it will be a prioritization if you put a guidance in that says somebody falls under here, other does, and especially if having fulfilling or not fulfilling is linked to certain incentives or lack of incentives. So I don't think we will come out of that discussion, out of that problem.
But let me ask you a provocative question. Give me an example where you're more of an expert than me. Give me an example of a disease area. So never mind the definition, where you would say, yes, that's a disease, I guess, then still, but there is no unmet medical need or a very low one. And to the extent that you say, basically you would signal then to the pharma industry and say, or any other medical device industry, and say, don't bother with finding something for that disease area because we think it's essentially solved. It's not cured, because if it would be cured, then it would not be a disease anymore, right, I guess? So that's what I'm saying. It's very difficult.
And I hear what you're saying, Thomas, but then we don't need a definition.
I didn't ask for it.
No. Maybe then when we can agree. But, well, you could say, and then you can push back. Hypertension. We got, I don't know how many different treatments for hypertension. But of course, still there are patients who have untreatable hypertension. And there are still pharma companies that spend their time and money developing products that are Me Too products. So they waste time and patience and clinical trials for something that is unacceptable from a societal perspective, so to speak. They should waste their money and the patient time on something where there is a bigger need. Then we start graduating. So, but I agree with you, but I still think if we have a definition, there will be someone who doesn't fulfill the definition. That's the simply. But I also agree with you that I think most pharma want to develop products where there is an unmet medical need, because that means there's also a market to sell the product. But But apparently there is a need to, and the way we've been using these definitions in Europe is to drive incentives, as you know, as good as I do, driving incentives and driving development in certain direction by using carrots and sticks. And that's most likely the same if you look at the proposals here. We want to steer development in certain directions. And by the way, I remember what I forgot. I'm aware of a scientific publication by some Dutch researchers, I think it's back in 2019, that tried to look up how many definitions exist on unmet medical need. Yeah. And I can't remember, is it either 16 or 19 different? Yeah. So maybe we can come up with a 20th one, let's see.
Hope not. I have a few more questions. I just want to kind of check in with the room, and then perhaps also online, if there are any questions that anyone would like to pose at this stage, or any observations anyone wants to make. Anyone in the room before we... Maria, can you introduce yourself as well?
We can borrow one here.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Thank you for an excellent panel. My name is Maria Dutart, and I'm from UPATI, European Patients Academy. And listening to this excellent conversation, I'm thinking of the contradiction that was also brought up by you at this recent discussion on patient experience data. And in the past years, there have been a lot of initiatives like UPATI, also training patients and patient communities to translate their lived experience into the language of researchers, regulators, and HD bodies. And now it seems that for some patient communities, this new definition might be closing that door, and that the dialogue is sort of, it's not inviting these communities into that dialogue anymore. So I am concerned looking at this development and thinking of all that good work and initiative done also by patient organizations like Eurodis as well.
Rosa, do you share that concern? Or?
Yes, if I may, I mean very quickly, because I think the main message that the Eurodis wanted to put forward since the beginning of this discussion was to not go for these narrow or very difficult definitions, engage in a multi-stakeholder dialogue. That's not only because I think it obviously links to the fact that the patients want to be active, involved, that they have experience and expertise. But it goes beyond, if you allow me to add. I think we're moving, there's a lot of also in people working in regulation and how to make regulation better adapted to the future. I think it also goes into making this legislation future-proof. We talk about adaptive regulation, and how can it be adapted if we don't know maybe what are going to be the unmet medical needs? You need to have predictability, but you also need to have some flexibility. And who better than the patients, the clinicians that know the unmet medical needs? So I think it's also for the future. This legislation is not open every 3 years, it's like decades, right? So we want to get it right. So, yeah. Okay.
Anita, any additional points?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a no-brainer that, patients, of course, have got to be involved. They're the only people who fully understand the full spectrum of the conditions. And in PKU, having to cope with the burden of diet therapy day after day, measure everything that you eat, the psychosocial impact, the anxiety, everything, that can only come from the patients themselves. We've learned that from the patients, the impact. And what worries me is, for a condition like PKU, the people who do the best are the people who've either got, generally highly educated parents and people who've been supported. There's a whole community out there who don't have that support. There's a whole community out there of patients who've got low IQ. They can't speak up for themselves, and they're going to be well left behind if legislation comes in that doesn't allow them to have these therapies. The new therapies could transform their life. Why not give them that opportunity?
Any other comments or questions at the back?
Thank you very much. A bit more of a technical question to some extent, but where in the process of the marketing authorization would the check for the definition whether it is met, both for unmet medical need but also high unmet medical need, potentially, if any of those are agreed in the legislation, take place as like a step in the process, so to say? Because we know that there are steps to check for an orphan drug designation, etc. So I was just wondering, because I think that is not clear in the legislation, so if you have any first thoughts on that. Thank you.
Stefan, would you have?
I think you answered the question yourself. That it's currently unclear where it's going to happen. So we're going to have the final text, but maybe you know more, Thomas. Eh?
No, I agree. I agree, but I think it's a good question actually. You haven't addressed. It's not clear, but at least industry interprets this more at the end of the process, that you will get this verdict, and that's exactly another sort of point that creates, that is a challenge, of course, right? Because other elements in the certainly when we talk about an orphan medicine, like significant benefit, orphan drug status, and so on, you get early in the process. So as a company, you have more certainty how you go through the process. Here you go still through the process, and then at the end, at least, as you say, if that will become clear, but that's how at the moment industry interprets this. At the end of the process, you get this verdict. That's not particularly helpful, of course, right?
And then you used the word high unmet medical need. I can't remember whether that's still in the proposal because for me, now I'm more speaking as a doctor, what is unmet medical need versus high unmet medical need? I think that would be an even bigger challenge for us to define, because then we definitely have to see that, well, is PKU more dangerous than for the patient than for any other? That's going to be even harder to distinguish who is going to get the high unmet medical need. But if legislators like us to do this, then we will have to do so. That's the rules of the game.
It's still in the Commission's proposal, but I believe Council is suggesting to delete it. Yeah. Thomas, you talked about kind of where it comes, kind of the end of the process and the regulatory process. What about, we haven't spoken much about value assessment and pricing reimbursement. What would you see as the potential implication, consequence after the regulatory approval process?
Well, I think I indicated to it, right? There are these kind of issues play at two levels. One is it's directly linked to the incentives you would get from Europe. So you get, if you meet the definition, you will get certain extras, like in longer regulatory protection period and the market exclusivity period, because one of the novelty of the revision of the EU pharmaceutical legislation is that these kind of incentives will become more modular, right, and linked to definitions, but also other obligations. So at the moment, it's more predictable and more standard. You get what you get.
Yep.
In the future, it will become all more modular. That's one element. And then, but on the other end, as we discussed, as you have already now, of course, you get from Europe often drug designation. That sort of stamp for your products will give you a certain position in national discussions around access. If now on top of that you get this kind of label that this product contributes to meeting an unmet medical need or does not contribute to make a significant impact on an unmet medical need of a disease, that's, I guess it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that this will be either positive or more challenging, of course. So that's another thing that where I sometimes have the feeling the European legislator was not fully conscious of this kind of unintentional consequences of these kind of measures or instruments, because the focus, of course, is always very much on the first part, like the incentives, but not what would downstream be also an impact on these kind of issues.
But Thomas, don't you also think that having the label of meeting an unmet medical need could incentivize, now I'm going to be very diplomatic, incentivize some of your colleagues to ask for a higher price? Gold is always better than silver.
Yeah. I don't but I cannot speculate what they ask for, of course. When you negotiate, you have a number of arguments, right, in your toolkit to negotiate. First, the value of the product, first of all, right? Mm. Based on clinical data, etc. What does the therapy do? What do you think the value is? And therefore, what kind of price do you think can be attached to it? I don't think it will immediately say, I get the unmet medical need, and therefore it would be even higher than what. I think it will be more give you a stronger argument for what you wanted to argue for anyway in the first case, first place.
Danai, do we have any questions? I'm sure we do, but any questions you want to flag?
Yes, thank you, Teresa. And what is actually important here is that the audience reminded us that it's not only a legal question, but it's actually an ethical question as well. Also, so we are talking about people and not only numbers or labels. So the definition is one thing, but what does it actually mean? Because we are talking about 30 million people in Europe, more than 30 million people. And I had, this is a topic very close to my heart because I had the experience living for almost 4 years next to a person that was a rare disease patient and champion. So all these issues that were discussed in the panel now were addressed, and this is what the audience also is trying to understand better. Are all orphan diseases de facto unmet needs? And if we have a narrow definition and some are falling or not, how do we prioritize them? How is there competition between what is going to be included or not? So again, on the definition and asking for examples on other member states, if we see something successful there. And one other question that I would like to highlight for the audience, that the current EU pharma regulation enacted in medical regulation enacted in 2000 is considered a success because it increased successfully the number of market orphan drugs from 8 to over 200. Do you think that this ongoing revision is actually going to continue this advancement?
Rosa, do you want to take the last question? Or Stefan, attention.
Very quickly, I can just say, we hope that, with the new revision, the progress made will continue, will be, strengthened. We hope it won't take back any progress done in this area. We hope it will fix also any issues that were, it was the first legislation, so that's our hope. In the technical, I defer to my panelists.
From my perspective, an EMA perspective, I hope it will create more therapies available for patients in Europe. We as a medicines agency, have no interest in restricting access or availability of medicines to patients. So if change in the legislation can improve development and product coming to the European market and European patients, I will be happy. So I hope that goes in that direction. To the first question, whether now we can start discussing the definition, whether all orphan drugs should automatically qualify for an unmet medical need. Well, we're going to see what comes out as we've been discussing now. But today, let's take with the current definition of unmet medical need, if you get an orphan designation and you develop your product and you maintain your orphan designation, you get 10 years of market exclusivity as a company. So that's the big carrot that you'd get out of this. And if another company is going to break that exclusivity, then they have to demonstrate that they have something that is either better in terms of efficacy and or safety, or it could be something that improves patient care. So let's say for something children, the first medication approved is a big horse tablet, and then you come with some very palatable syrup that children can take. That could be an example of things. So I think that partly answers the thinking around this, that, well, the door is not completely closed, but it's a more narrow, it's difficult to come as number two as long as the first product is eating the carrot, so to speak. And I guess that would most likely not change, but let's see. Again, this is all up in the air.
Okay. I think I saw one more hand in the audience, or is that a question? Does someone? No? Okay. Perhaps moving from kind of beyond the critique and going into more constructive proposals. Anita, when we think about how to identify and measure unmet needs, what kind of criteria should we be considering to make sure that we're really capturing the full picture? I know we can't, at the moment, the trilogue negotiations are what they are. At the same time, there's a consultation on patient experience data out there. What is it? What are the kind of criteria, the measures that you'd like to see, and that potentially could also weigh into the development of the EMA scientific guidelines?
Okay. Well, I don't know if they'll go into the scientific guidelines, so I'm going to give PKU as the example. But the complex, they've got to be multi-dimensional, they've got to be patient-centered, and they've really got to take into account the different life stages of the patients. And, you know, if I put a list together for PKU, it would be that long. And we would be looking at things like neurocognitive outcome, the IQ, we'd be looking at executive function, and that wouldn't be just a tick box exercise, that would be to see often people have problems with memory, they have problems with organizational skills, they have problems with attention. So we would want to know that they can perform at school, we would want to know that they can keep down a job, we would want to know that they can drive safely, we would want to know that they can manage money. All of these things need to be taken into account. Things like the mental health, anxiety, depression, is huge, often neglected, often not taken into account, but that would need to be considered. The number of medications that they're on for the mental health issues would need to be considered. But it is all the psychosocial issues in terms of relationships. Many people with poorly controlled PKU, they have problems. They often become angry. I've been to weddings that haven't lasted very long in PKU because people haven't been able to maintain the relationships. That's important for people's lives. It would be the social situation. How many people avoid different social situations would need to be considered. People's ability to take care of the diet, organize themselves, loss of people's income because they're taking care of themselves, the amount of income that they're spending on the dietary treatments, that the so-called conventional treatment that governments won't even pay for in terms of supporting for the low-protein foods would need to be taken into account. So I say the list is endless, and but without bringing in the patients, without bringing in that consultation, a lot of these things would be missed. People would just look at IQ, they would just look at executive function, that would be it, and end of story, but it's a huge, huge list.
Okay. Rosa, so that's from a PKU perspective more. If your orders were to define the kind of criteria that you'd like to be considered in definition, future guidelines, what would be some of those criteria from your perspective?
Okay, so a few thoughts that we have been reflecting on this since the beginning. So we are now at a very advanced stage. So going to, with what we have right now, of course, we will prefer clear criteria rather than, ambiguous criteria that don't, incentivize the innovations and make things more difficult. Now, that's easy to say, but of course, clear criteria might be easy when you don't have a treatment. So that's a clear thing that can be there and that should be there, of course, because that's a big unmet need. The difficulty gets when you go then, okay, there are existing therapies, how do you go about it? And then what we think is that, if we look at the text right now, I don't want to get technical, but one thing that we notice, if you go for a reduction in morbidity and mortality, that would be difficult, that would be problematic for many rare diseases. You explained it better with PKU example, and there are many more. So we would like to avoid this type of, criteria that are very rigid and that will leave a lot of patients, a lot of people outside of this, of the possibility of having a treatment. So that's like around clear and not clear. But I think I'm sorry that I will repeat myself here, but the main thing that we would like in those criteria is to be inclusive of the patients. So really include us there and my colleagues, because the next week there will be a trilogue. I think apparently the parties, the parliament and the council will discuss again, and will discuss about the involvement of patients at the EMA. And that's, we thought it was a given that was very, well recognized by everyone, but it's actually been discussed. We cannot believe why, but okay. It's been discussed. So our call is to really keep the patients at the center, keep them in the consultations, along the whole life cycle, because they do have the experience, the expertise, they have contributed these decades that they have been contributing. Leaving them outside will be really breaking the social contract, which is, what we're talking about here in Gashland. So.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, we spoke about the guidelines. There's still many unknowns. You highlighted the role of the Patient and Consumer Health Committee in EMA. Do you have any observations about what the likely process is going to be? Will we likely see an inclusive stakeholder approach to developing those guidelines, or too early to tell? I've seen the language in the legislation has changed. On the Commission side, may involve or may consult stakeholders, including patients, industry. Parliament changed this to shall. Council deleted it. So I'm just keen to...
Again, it's a moving target, and I won't want to polish the crystal ball. I think EMA have a strong interest in engaging with patients. We have a long-standing good experience in involving patient in our decision making. I would be sad to see if that changes to the opposite.
Okay, thank you. Time is almost up. I just want to give the panelists a chance to any kind of final message or a final ask to European but also national policymakers. This isn't a Brussels debate. Ultimately, this will happen, materialize, operationalize in the member states. Thomas, starting with you, do you have a final message, final ask?
Yeah, no, I think two very simple ones, right? One is that the definition will be broader at least than what the Commission had originally proposed. I think the direction of travel is optimistic, but let's see the outcome. And the main reason for that, as we discussed today, is to make sure that no patient or disease area feels excluded. And second, to Stefan's point, is of course, and also linking what you said earlier, there's a publication out there, I think I have it as well, where there are, you said 19, I think somewhere, like more than a dozen definitions, which shows that it is very complex. And I think in order to overcome that sort of complexity, or to make sure that you arrive at maybe a desirable outcome, is to have indeed a multi-stakeholder involvement in the further development of the criteria, because the definition is just one element. It's then how you implement this definition. And it will be very important to involve the stakeholders, not only patients, of course they're the first, because they know actually this is the best, but also physicians and hopefully also industry.
Thank you. Anita?
Oh, my goodness. I've seen in PKU that drug therapy is transformational. It can change people's lives. It's not always predictable. I want people with PKU to live their lives, not just exist their lives. And there's a huge difference between the two. I think it's wrong to expect people with rare inherited metabolic disorders to maintain for the rest of their lives diet therapy that's relentless, that it's old-fashioned, it's never moved on, when there are drug therapies and it's just legislation holding it back. I think, as I said before, it's a tragedy and that shouldn't happen.
Thank you. Rosa?
This is tough, but I guess goes to the core of what Aurordis, wants. And what Aurora is reflected for the future in 2030, I invite you again to read that very beautiful study that gathered everyone together to think about these issues. And it's about leaving nobody behind. And in the rare disease community, that means in many different dimensions. So like leave no rare disease or no patient with a rare disease outside of this, even the ultra rare conditions and the ones that we reflected today, the ones that might have a treatment, but a suboptimal or a toxic one or a difficult one. And then also around member states, of course, so leave nobody behind because they are living in one member state and not in another. So for patients, everything is important. Innovation, access to innovation, sustainability of this, etc. Yeah.
Thank you. Stefan, perhaps less of a message for policymakers. You might have a message for the patient community or developer community, or any kind of final word of wisdom.
Well, definitely you're waiting for the legislators to agree on something, and then we're going to pick up from there. I think I'm just going to repeat what I said before. EMA is committed to involving patients in all our decision-making processes and being transparent about our decisions, and we have had lengthy and good experience doing so, and I don't see any intention of changing that.
Thank you. We still have 1.5 minutes left. I'm going to hand over to Tobias just for a closing remark, Tobias.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to this great panel. And I mean, just for a closing remark, in this conference here in Gastein, we have often heard about the orange elephant in the room. I mean, this discussion also includes the green elephant in the room, green as the color of money. I mean, we as patient organizations, we cannot resolve the deficits of the healthcare systems. Neither are we interested in the shareholder values of the industries. Our business is access to innovation, is access to the best standard of care possible. That is what we are aiming for. And I'm truly happy that I'm not in your shoes, Stefan, because we have just discussed the complexity in one disease. But when I look to Rosa and when we look at just rare diseases, this is 6,000 plus, maybe 8,000, maybe 10,000 diseases, which all have different unmet medical needs. So in the end, if I can give a recommendation is for this ethical discussion that we need to have not just what we can afford, but also about what we want to afford, what we want to invest in. Let's be as flexible as possible to not set things in stone, that we are flexible and that we are reactive to this ethical dialogue that needs to be a social dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Tobias. Thank you to all for joining and for participating in the debate. I think I've been asked for you to fill in a feedback form. I don't know where it is, but please do. Hopefully this discussion will continue. Thank you.